are standing on the shoulders of the ones who came before us. They are saints and they are heroes.
Welcome to the Forgotten History of Women's Suffrage. Today we're coming to you from the East Tennessee History Center on the corner of Gay and Clinch Avenue in beautiful downtown Knoxville. The History Center has put together a special exhibit for the centennial of women's suffrage. They had originally planned an exhibit, a larger exhibit, that would have been a graphic novel of the events that occurred on the night of November 27, 1917 in Knoxville, when there was an armed confrontation over suffrage at the old Knoxville courthouse. But the pandemic intervened, and by the time they were allowed to reopen, they had to scale down and create what is the exhibit that we're going to see today. A very nice exhibit, and we hope that they will be able to, for the 2021 Centennial Plus, put on the exhibit originally planned. I am Wanda, your host, and we will be visiting the exhibit in the Main Street streetscape area just outside the main exhibit hall of the East Tennessee History Center. We are now inside the East Tennessee History Center, and we have with us today, or privileged to have with us today, Cheryl Henderson, the Executive Director of the East Tennessee History Center. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, we're thrilled to have you here. You've been so much a part of our exhibits and all we've done here. We're thrilled to have you.
Oh, well, thank you. This exhibit today is called Marching to Victory, and it's in the streetscape of the museum. Tell me a little bit about what the streetscape was before we added this exhibit in.
Well, the streetscape is really a setting in downtown Knoxville with a lot of real artifacts from that time. We have a bus here that actually ran on the street outside the building here, but it's full of artifacts and stories from the time of, I guess, the early 1900s through mid-1900s when streetcars were discontinued.
So it's a perfect setting for
Perfect. The time period is perfect for that.
the suffrage campaign
Yeah.
and the ultimate victory of suffrage. That was in Tennessee. What was special about Tennessee in that?
Well, Tennessee had the privilege of being casting the final vote that passed women's suffrage across the whole country.
Exactly.
So we're very proud of that.
I think it's something we should be more proud of than we have been, and I think it's something that we need to make more prominent in our own state's history. So can we walk through the exhibit today and take a look? We have our camera person here. I want to thank David Jones once again for coming and helping us maintain this program in the midst of a pandemic and without a studio. So thank you, Dave. Let's walk over here, and the first stop on this this walk is the Remember the Ladies silhouette. Now, whose idea was it to put these silhouettes and mannequins in this space?
It was Adam Alfrey. Adam is our curator of exhibitions, and he designed all of this, and he's been really interested in it too, so he worked really hard on this. And I think Hannah Rexroad assisted him with this too.
Okay, well, Adam has done an amazing job in the main exhibit here, and I've often told people that telling the story through artifacts can be interesting or it can be dull, and in some museums you'll see a glass case with a single item and a long storyboard and that's it, and you have to work to understand the history.
You do, yeah.
Mostly in this exhibit, I think that you get the history much quicker the way it's arranged. She's done a fabulous job. And so having the silhouettes of these women dressed as they might have been dressed in the early 1900s in Knoxville helps us to understand, I think, this story. And he starts the story here with Abigail Adams. And Abigail, before her husband John Adams became president, expressed her sentiment to him about the formation of the country. And she basically said, "I long to hear that you have declared an independency." That's before the Declaration of Independence. "And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose will be necessary for you to make, I desire that you remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power in the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could." And aside from that, she went on to warn him that if particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, We are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. Wow.
Amazing.
She was way ahead of her time.
Yes.
In the 1700s, pushing the position of women, which married women at that point in time didn't have many rights, did they?
No.
I don't recall much of any. And so these women represent the earliest discussion before we had a constitution, before we had a country, on making this a country that would be kinder, more accepting of women. And then we have this beautiful mannequin. And the story here is about how the information spread among women as they began to think about their position and their rights. And so, can you give us some examples of the things women did in the earliest of days to try to get their fellow women to understand? I know they would they had parlor parties. They would invite their neighbors in because women couldn't go out in the streets. That was considered inappropriate for women to be unescorted by males on the street. And so they would invite their friends into their homes and do parlor parties. And there are some wonderful, wonderful plays and poems that were created to be presented at the parlor parties to help women raise their consciousness. I think it's important to remember that when this started, it wasn't really just a suffrage movement. It was a women's rights movement because married women couldn't own property or enter contracts. They had no right to their children. They could be given away without the mother's consent. Fathers could give the children away even before they were born without the mother's consent. And so they had little opportunity to express themselves or to participate in how the society was formed. And so the initial movement addressed a lot of things like, well, for example, women could not divorce even an abusive husband, a drunken husband who was physically abusive. Women couldn't divorce him. And if they did divorce him, they didn't get the children. The children had to stay alone with that abuser. And so that was a concern. Equal pay, opportunities for jobs and education, public education, even publicly funded education up through the early 1900s was often closed to girls. Boys could go, but girls couldn't. And so girls wound up often in the factories working for terrible wages, very long hours, and no chance at an education or a way to really advance. And so the early women addressed all those things: divorce laws, custody laws, equal pay for equal work, educational opportunities, and so forth. Then they eventually concluded that the single most important right in a democracy was the right to vote. And that if women got the right to vote, they believed then women could influence the laws as they affected things like equal pay and custody and so forth and so on. And so they gathered in these parlor meetings in their homes to spread the word and to convince their sisters to both realize what their situation really was and to begin to think about ways to improve that situation. And that's all really represented here. And you see a woman here with the basket who's obviously a homemaker, dressed as a homemaker, tending to just the domestic chores. That was really about all that was available to women at that time. And then we go from the late 1700s, or the late 1700s with Abigail Adams, to Seneca Falls in 1848. Seneca Falls was, of course, in upstate New York, a small town, but it happened to be a place where Elizabeth Cady Stanton lived and Lucretia Mott. There were a lot of Quakers settled there. And the Quakers were known for being committed to peace, committed to making sure that whatever changes were made peacefully. And that's an important thing to know about the suffrage movement, because the suffrage movement, the women's suffrage movement, is the first movement in the world that we've been able to discover that enfranchised 27 million people without a war. And not only was there no war, there was not even the shedding of a single drop of blood, at least on their side. Now, their blood was shed, they were attacked, they were abused at times, and all of those, that violence that came against them, they never returned the violence. They were at heart a peaceful movement and remained that. But in 1848, when Elizabeth Cady Stanton had the audacity to suggest to the first Women's Rights Convention that they should work for the right of suffrage for women, it caused a ripple throughout the United States. Years later, she described it as the whole country was seized with hysteria from Maine to California because of her suggestion that women should have a voice in government. It at least got their attention, didn't it? Yes. And so they made their demands at that convention and began with those demands the first actual organized movement in this United States to get women the right to vote. Now there were, of course, most countries in the world did not include women in their governmental system very readily. And there were movements in all the other countries, or most other countries, for women's right to vote. Most of them got it before we did. It's surprising to look at the list of countries that gave their women the right to vote before the United States did. We were sort of late to that party. So where do we go next on this, Cheryl? This is the trolley you were talking about?
Yeah, this is the trolley that actually ran on the street right outside the building here. It was...
Yeah, it's, okay.
This may not even be important.
Was it on Gay Street?
It ran on Gay Street and also ran on Prince Avenue, and it ran in several places in Knoxville during its period. So we're really pleased to have that. It's really unusual.
It is, and it really gives, and then behind us is the drugstore, the corner drugstore that was that also on Gay Street or in this downtown area?
This is based on what corner drugstores would look like at the time.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Bud Albers, whose family was in the drug business. Back then, drug business meant something different.
Right, the pharmacy business.
So
Okay.
the pharmacy business.
Okay.
Designed this for us based on his family's use.
Wonderful,
very
wonderful.
nice.
It's a great setting. It's what
It is.
if you were marching for suffrage, you'd be marching past one of these.
You would, yeah,
So
you would.
this is a good setting.
We also have over here something really interesting. We have a treadle. Let me get this.
Okay.
What have we got here? Oh, we've got a treadle drill, like dental drill. And so the dentist had to sit there and treadle it the whole time and push it like you would a
with his
sewing
foot.
machine, yes, to repair a tooth. Can you imagine that? I can't.
Wow. I don't even like it when it's electronic. So.
I don't even imagine like it when I'm asleep.
All right, and so the next. That's okay. You're doing fine. The next stop, actually, the picture we're seeing here in the background is a scene from Chattanooga, it looks like, in the turn of the century. Okay. And we have the beginnings of the modern movement here. And I guess the point to be made there was that there were, after the Civil War, the effort to get the new Reconstruction amendments through was headed up by obviously the North and the Northern senators and the people in power. And when it came to what voting rights former slaves would have, for whatever reason, the determination was made that the 15th Amendment would enfranchise only male former slaves, not female former slaves. And that caused quite a bit of consternation in the movement. And as a matter of fact, there was a lot of controversy over whether the national leaders of the national women's movement should support the 15th Amendment because it excluded women. And the 14th Amendment, though ambiguous in some of its language, also introduced the notion that men specifically into the Constitution. Before that, it had all been, all the rights were addressed as rights of citizens and persons in the general language. The first time the word male appears in the Constitution as the 14th Amendment, and it appears there twice. And so some of the women believe that they should not support the 15th Amendment because it excluded women, and the 14th Amendment because it introduced the concept of a special aristocracy of sex, as they like to call it, in our constitutional law. Other women felt they should support the 15th Amendment and the 14th Amendment as taking a baby step in the right direction. And so eventually, the disagreements between the women on whether to support the Reconstruction Amendments or whether not to support the Reconstruction Amendments were resolved, and they formed the National American Woman Suffrage Association, and here the silhouettes show us those, showing us that the women were able to come together again and work together on the emancipation of women after the emancipation of black men. And here we have a mannequin that is dressed like the suffragists might be dressed at that particular time. They began wearing white, and yellow was a big color. Actually, yellow became more associated with the suffrage movement when the women in Kansas used sunflowers as a symbol of the suffrage movement. Now later on in Tennessee, you're hiding from me, Cheryl. Later on in Tennessee, what did the Tennessee women adopt for their symbol of suffrage? Do you remember?
Oh, the yellow rose, which is the significance of the dress and the banner.
Right, and so she has yellow flowers on her hat, and the poster that she's holding, Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? These women held at the White House big, large banners that said that, and often in the parades, banners that would stretch all across the street and keep asking the president how long women would have to wait for liberty, how long before the president would put his strength and courage behind the movement. And so that was, and then we have a story here on the Dixie Tour. You can read all about it. There's our old Market Square, you can see it in the photograph there. That was a time when, after the arrests of the silent sentinels who stood at the White House gates began, after a period of time, the chief of police of the District of Columbia, actually the commissioner of police for the District of Columbia, Louis Brownlow, ordered the arrests of the suffragists. And they were put into jails that had been condemned because they were considered uninhabitable for men. And they put the women in these horrible conditions and eventually got more and more brutal with them in their attempts to discourage the movement. They were frustrated because these women who were silent sentinels, once they were arrested and sent to the jails, other women would come right out on the street to support them and to take their place. And so it became sort of an endless revolving door. And so after some of the maltreatment of these women, Maud Younger decided that she would participate in what was called the Dixie Tour, and they came to Knoxville, among other places, came to Tennessee on a tour to tell the people of Tennessee how the women in D.C. and Boston and New York and elsewhere were being treated just because they wanted to have the right to vote. And when that happened, we wound up with an armed confrontation at our old Knox County courthouse over suffrage. And it's too long a story to tell now, but it's told very succinctly on the poster here, and it would be a good thing to come in and read about as you start to understand how controversial the suffrage movement was. And then the National Women's Party became really almost notorious because it actually started out as the Congressional Union, was the name that they used. They changed the name to National Women's Party fairly shortly after their organization. And they were the ones who were most confrontational. They were the ones who did what actually Susan B. Anthony had recommended years before, and that was decided to hold the party, political party, in power responsible for the failure of women's suffrage. So it didn't matter to them whether they were Democrats or Republicans. If they didn't get women's suffrage and used their political clout for women's suffrage, then they were branded as the enemy, essentially. Very controversial tactic that brought a lot of attention to the movement and made a lot of contribution. Okay, now, Cheryl, we are at my favorite part of this exhibit, because this is not a copy of something, this is the real thing.
You're in the presence of the original document here.
Yeah, and tell our viewers what it is that is so important about this letter that we see here on the shelf.
This letter was written by Feb Byrne to her son, who was in the Tennessee legislature, and then the vote was tied whether or not to pass suffrage in Tennessee, and the vote was tied, and she wrote her son and told him to please vote for suffrage. And he did, so.
And this is the letter, right?
This is the actual letter here.
I just love that. I love it for several reasons.
Yeah.
First of all, we have the envelope that has the postmark on it, so we know that it arrived there at the very last second before the vote, because it's postmarked the day before the vote.
Exactly.
Just barely got there in time.
This is in the collection of the McClung collection. That's on the 3rd floor, where there are various documents.
And it's pretty rare to have this letter out on public view.
Yes,
It's
it
usually
is.
only copies. I'm only aware of two, maybe 3 times that it's been available for people to look at. And I know that I have seen people come through the exhibit and just tear up looking at this letter. And I also know from reading the Nashville papers that when Harry Byrne had to explain his sudden last-minute change of vote that broke the tie, that got women's suffrage to pass in Tennessee, he pulled this letter out of his pocket and explained his mother had asked him to vote for suffrage, and he thought it was a good thing for a boy to follow what his mother's advice, basically.
Right.
There were newspaper articles after that then berated that and said and many of the anti-suffrage people, legislators, were claiming there never was a letter, there was not such a thing. And there are some movies that talk about a telegram that came in at the last minute. There was no telegram. It's a letter. And we know it's a letter because we have it right here. And there you also have a picture of Harry Byrne. You have a picture of some of the delegates at that time, and a picture of the Senate chamber when it was just before the vote in the Senate chamber. The House chamber was the one that tied us all up, that almost lost it. What a great thing to have here. And the story of the War of the Roses is told in this case as well. So it's well worth coming down to see.
We have people call just to come to see this.
Oh, yes.
They hear we've been having them come from out of town just to see this.
Oh, yes. It's a really, really big deal. I remember one of the justices of the Tennessee Supreme Court who came when we had a special exhibit here before we unveiled the Tennessee Women's Suffrage Memorial on Market Square. And the letter was on display in that exhibit, and she just broke into tears looking at it. It's a very moving thing. So if you get a chance to get down here to see this exhibit, don't miss this part. It's just lovely. And beside the letter, beside the envelope, what do we have there?
We have some different suffrage pins that people would have worn on their lapel to advertise, I guess, the fact that they were supporting the suffrage movement.
Okay, and all of these are pro-suffrage pins. There were also some anti-suffrage pins worn by the people who oppose suffrage, of course. These things have become extremely rare and extremely valuable. And it's a good opportunity to see some of the more rare ones in this exhibit. And you'll notice that the old ones, the original ones, were really very small. We have in the exhibit that we hope someday to belong to a suffrage museum, a collection of exhibits that includes the antes buttons and the little 1 inch, about the size of this blue button here, 1 inch button that says 36 on it.
Oh, yeah.
And that was simply a way of indicating that that person wearing it hoped that Tennessee would become the, quote, perfect 36, the final state necessary to ratify the amendment and make it law. So it has just been, it's very nice to see these buttons, and some of them are ones that I've not seen outside of this exhibit, so it's very good. I see that we're about out of time, and so we're going to have to interrupt our tour of this exhibit and go ahead to our Did You Know segment. Did you know that when the Titanic sank in 1912, aboard the Titanic were 8 women, at least 8 women, who were suffragists? Some of them survived and some did not. We will soon be presenting a program from the Titanic where you can learn about the 8 suffragists who were on the Titanic and which of them survived. So that's new information discovered in the research that's been done for the centennial. Thank you so much for joining with us, and be sure to tune in. We will finish the tour here in our future shows, and we will also go to the Titanic and learn about the women who were on that fateful ship. Do tune us in again. I'm Wanda Sobieski, host for the Suffrage Coalition, and I would remind you that at suffragecoalition.org we have a link where you can go back and see all of our shows. It's a link to our YouTube channel. So if you want to see everything we've done for this year in this pandemic time, go to the suffragecoalition.org. Thank you.
I am standing on the shoulders of the ones who came before me. I am honored by their passion for our liberty. I will stand a little taller, I will work a little longer, and my shoulders will be there to hold the ones who follow me.